2 hours, the presenters on every news channel were saying injured but expected to make a full recovery, and I have no idea why, but it made me so angry.
There is a woman who has stood 2 feet from nearly every defining moment of the modern royal story and said almost nothing about any of it. She flew to Paris to bring her sister's body home. She helped read at the funeral watched by 2.5 billion people. She has stood at christenings, weddings, and hospital bedsides for 3 generations of the same family. And in nearly 30 years of tabloid storms, documentaries, memoirs, and viral comparisons, she has given the press almost nothing to work with. Her name is Lady Sarah McCorquodale. She is Princess Diana's older sister. And right now, her name is being used in headlines and video titles, claiming she has finally spoken out about Meghan Markle. Here's the problem. There's no verified statement behind those claims. No interview. No quote. No on-record source. What actually exists is a much older, much more interesting story about a woman who has spent her entire adult life deliberately staying out of the spotlight her sister never escaped, and about a media narrative, the Diana-Meghan comparison, that has proven almost impossible to kill. That's the story worth telling. Long before the world knew the name Diana Spencer, there was simply a family of 4 children growing up at Park House on the Sandringham estate. Sarah was the eldest. Diana was the youngest of the 3 girls. The age gap between them was significant enough that Sarah was already an adult, out working in London, while Diana was still a teenager. There's a detail from their history that rarely makes it into the breathless royal drama videos, but it matters. Sarah dated Prince Charles first. In the mid-1970s, before Charles ever seriously considered Diana, he and Sarah were involved. It was Sarah who is widely credited with introducing her younger sister to Charles at a shooting weekend in Sussex. Whatever complicated feelings that history might carry, Sarah went on to become one of the steadiest presences in Diana's adult life, and later, in her sons' lives. Sarah also lived through something of her own that rarely gets attention. She has spoken previously, and only briefly, about struggling with anorexia nervosa as a young woman. It's a detail that adds real weight to the idea that she understands pressure, image, and public scrutiny from the inside, not just as a bystander to her sister's fame. She married Neil McCorquodale in 1980 and settled into a life that looks almost nothing like a royal biography. She became a master of the Belvoir hunt. She served a term as High Sheriff of Lincolnshire. She raised 3 children in Lincolnshire, largely out of the press. This is not a woman who drifted into obscurity by accident. It's a life built, seemingly on purpose, away from cameras. And yet she was never absent from the moments that mattered. When Diana died in August 1997, it was Sarah, alongside their sister Jane, who flew to Paris to accompany the body home. She served as co-executor of Diana's will. She became president of the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, which raised more than £100 million for charity before winding down in 2012. She was at William's wedding. She was at Harry's wedding to Meghan in 2018. By multiple accounts, she and William in particular have remained close over the years. This is the actual record. A woman deeply, structurally embedded in this family's most important moments, who has almost never used those moments as an opportunity to speak publicly about her sister's legacy, her nephews, or the controversies swirling around them. If you've spent any time on royal content platforms recently, you may have come across videos, articles, or posts claiming that Lady Sarah has broken decades of silence to weigh in on Meghan Markle. It's a compelling premise. It plays on something real. The fact that her silence has, in fact, been remarkable and consistent for almost 30 years. But compelling isn't the same as true. When you go looking for the actual substance behind these claims, a direct quote, a named interview, a dated public appearance where she addressed the subject, it isn't there. What tends to be there instead is a chain of vague sourcing, reports suggest, sources say, insiders reveal. These phrases can sound like journalism while doing none of journalism's actual work, which is naming a source, dating an event, and pointing to something on the record. This isn't a small distinction. There's an entire ecosystem of royal-adjacent content built around exactly this pattern. Take a real, well-known figure, invent a plausible-sounding development involving them, and rapid in language vague enough that it can't easily be fact-checked, but specific enough to feel urgent. Titles promise a bombshell. The video itself hedges constantly, reportedly, said to have sources close to. By the end, nothing verifiable has actually been claimed, but the viewer walks away believing something happened. It's worth naming this pattern because it isn't unique to Lady Sarah's story. It gets applied constantly to real people. Harry, Meghan, William, Kate, King Charles, because their names generate attention regardless of whether the underlying claim holds up. The most responsible thing a viewer can do with content like this is ask a simple question. What is the actual, checkable source? If a video won't answer that question, the claim probably can't survive contact with one. Here's what's genuinely verifiably true. The comparison between Meghan Markle and Princess Diana has been a fixture of royal media coverage for years, and it shows no sign of fading. That part isn't rumor. It's one of the most consistently documented threads in modern royal reporting. The comparison draws on some real surface parallels. Both women entered the same institution from outside it. Both became subjects of intense, sustained media attention almost overnight. Both have described struggling with the scrutiny that came with royal life, and both have spoken in their own ways about feeling unsupported by the institution around them at difficult moments. Diana gave her landmark BBC interview in 1995, describing her isolation inside the palace. Harry and Meghan gave their own landmark interview in 2021, describing feelings of isolation and inadequate institutional support. The echo between those two moments is part of why the comparison keeps resurfacing. It isn't purely manufactured. But the differences matter just as much, and serious commentators have made that case consistently. Diana married into the royal family in 1981, at a time when the press pack, the paparazzi economy, and the family's own media strategy operated completely differently than they do now. Meghan entered the family in 2018 into an institution that had already spent 2 decades absorbing lessons, some of them badly, from Diana's own story. Diana never had social media aimed at her. Meghan's entire royal tenure played out inside it. Diana's marriage produced 2 direct heirs to the throne. Harry, by contrast, was never going to be king, which changes the institutional stakes of his and Meghan's departure in ways that are easy to overlook. Royal historians and commentators have pushed back on the comparison from both directions. Some argue it does a disservice to Diana by flattening her into a symbol other people get compared to, rather than treating her as a specific person who lived through specific, unrepeatable circumstances. Others argue it does a disservice to Meghan, reducing her experience to a rerun of someone else's story instead of assessing it on its own terms. Both critiques are reasonable, and neither requires inventing a quote from anyone in Diana's family to make. It would be easy to fill the rest of this script with speculation about what Lady Sarah really thinks behind closed doors. Almost every piece of content covering this topic does exactly that. But the honest answer is simpler and less dramatic. We don't know what she thinks because she hasn't said. That's not a failure of reporting. It may be closer to a choice she's made and kept for 3 decades. Someone who lived through her sister's death being followed by paparazzi through a tunnel in Paris, who then watched that same sister's image get picked apart, romanticized, and endlessly reinterpreted by strangers for the rest of her own life, might reasonably conclude that staying quiet is not avoidance. It's protection. Protection of her own peace, and arguably, protection of a version of Diana that exists in memory rather than in headlines. There is a difference between no comment and no opinion. Silence doesn't mean neutrality, and it doesn't mean agreement or disagreement with anyone. It just means the public doesn't get access to that particular person's private thoughts. And in this case, that appears to be intentional. What can be said honestly is this. Diana's family, like most families, likely holds a range of views about how her legacy gets discussed, used, and compared to modern events. That would be true of literally any family with a famous relative. Assuming unanimous agreement or assuming a specific hidden dissent are both guesses dressed up as insight. Neither is supported by anything on the record. If the actual verifiable facts are this modest, why does content claiming otherwise keep circulating and keep finding an audience? Part of the answer is structural. Princess Diana remains one of the most searched, most emotionally resonant public figures of the last 50 years, nearly 3 decades after her death. Any content that puts her name in the title reliably draws attention, because millions of people still feel a genuine, personal connection to her story, even though they never met her. That emotional attachment is real and shouldn't be mocked, but it's also exactly what makes the audience vulnerable to content that invents developments in order to reactivate that attachment. Part of the answer is also that ongoing tension between Harry, Meghan, and the rest of the royal family provides a constant supply of raw material. Every real development, an interview, a Netflix release, a public appearance, a reported rift, becomes an opportunity to graft a new, unverified claim onto Diana's memory, because doing so borrows her emotional weight without requiring any actual reporting. And part of the answer is simply that ambiguity is profitable. A headline that says Diana's sister finally speaks generates curiosity precisely because it can't easily be checked in the 10 seconds someone spends scrolling past it. By the time a careful viewer goes looking for the source and finds nothing, the video has already done its job. None of this requires assuming bad faith on the part of every creator making this kind of content. Some of it is likely built from a kernel of real speculation that got smoothed over time into something that sounds more confirmed than it is. But the effect on the audience is the same either way. People walk away believing something happened that, as far as any verifiable record shows, did not. So, where does that leave the actual story of Lady Sarah McCorquodale? Somewhere quieter, and honestly somewhere more interesting than the version built on invented quotes. She is a woman who has spent almost 30 years standing at the exact center of one of the most photographed families on Earth, and who has consistently chosen not to add her voice to the noise around it. She was there for the worst day of that family's public life, and she has been there, quietly, for the good days since. Whatever she privately thinks about how her sister's memory gets used in modern arguments about Meghan Markle, about Harry, about the monarchy itself, she has kept that to herself. And every available piece of real evidence suggests she intends to keep it that way. That's not a cliffhanger. It's not a bombshell. But it might be the most honest thing that can currently be said about her. And in a media landscape that increasingly manufactures urgency out of thin air, honest and unresolved is sometimes the most respectful way to tell someone's story, especially when that someone has spent decades asking, in the only way she knows how, to be left out of the headlines. If you want to actually understand how the Diana-Meghan comparison developed and why it persists, that's a real, well-documented story, and a far more solid foundation for understanding this family than any claim that can't point to a source.